Hello, welcome. Welcome, everybody. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to the 2025 AI Policy Research Symposium. And today we're gathering to celebrate our AI Policy Hub Fellows for the 2024-2025 academic year. These are a cohort of scholars whose research is not only timely, but incredibly transformative in the AI governance space. The AI Policy Hub is an interdisciplinary initiative training forward-thinking researchers to develop effective governance and policy frameworks to guide artificial intelligence today and into the future. Research conducted through the AI Policy Hub helps policymakers and other AI decision makers act with foresight in a rapidly changing environment, right? It's incredibly fast. There's so many changes happening internationally, federally, and at the state level. We are housed under the AI Security Initiative, part of the University of California, Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, and also the Citrus Policy Lab, which is part of Citrus and the Banatao Institute. I am Brandy Noneke. I'm the co-director of the AI Policy Hub. I'm also the director of the Citrus Policy Lab and an associate research professor at the Goldman School of Public Policy. I would like to introduce my co-director, Genevieve Smith, who leads work at the Berkeley AI Research Lab. I believe it's the Responsible AI Initiative. Direct that. We also have one of our other directors who is currently on maternity leave, Jessica Newman. And Jessica and I stood up the AI Policy Hub about 3 years ago. And she also serves as the director of the AI Security Initiative at the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. She's greatly missed here today. I would like to introduce our fellows. So you can see them here. Sia Montauk Chowdhury, a PhD student in engineering computer science. Jaden Feroz, also within EECS. Ruby Han is our Goldman School of Public Policy student. Audrey Mitchell is a JD candidate at Berkeley Law. Ezene Nakwanwo, I always get it wrong. You should correct me. Very loud. A CS PhD student, and Laura Potok, PhD in social welfare. So we're incredibly honored to have you all here. We've been working with them for over the full academic year. Our fellows are conducting innovative research addressing several challenges for responsible AI governance, including AI incident reporting and what this means for our policy and legal strategies, AI watermarking to verify authenticity of content, responsible use of AI in the public sector, especially in public service provision, strategies to meaningfully engage stakeholders in AI development and its use, how generative AI is affecting evidence in the courtroom, and use of differential privacy to empower consumers to set their own privacy thresholds. Our fellows will each provide brief remarks about their work for about 7 minutes, and then we'll have a 3-minute transition between each of the fellows. We welcome you to ask a question at that time. Since we are recording, please wait for the handheld mic. That way we make sure that we get your audio on the recording. Also, if you have any ideas for how to further strengthen their work, if you have any connections to policymakers in either the public or the private sector, I know that the fellows would be incredibly grateful for your guidance and support. And we will conclude today's event with a keynote presentation from Gideon Lichfield, who is currently serving as a UC Berkeley Tech Policy Fellow and was former editor-in-chief of Wired. So we're very honored to have you here today, Gideon. Thank you for coming. And with that, I will pass it to our first student to present.
So I'm Shamantak Chaudhary. I'm a fourth-year PhD student in EECS, and my research has focused on privacy. And this is one aspect that I'm going to talk about today. So in today's world, there has been a massive improvement in storage technology, compute technology, and this has led to a lot of privacy issues because, we are all connected to the internet, and it's very easy for companies like Facebook to take our data and use it for other downstream tasks like advertisement. And this is the concern for privacy is reflected in legislation. But how do we even understand privacy? There have been several frameworks, and currently differential privacy is accepted to be the gold standard. And the reason is that differential privacy allows you to quantify the amount of privacy afforded in an algorithm, something that was not present in the previous frameworks. So privacy, you can quantify using differential privacy, but the problem is not solved because differential privacy allows you to set a privacy level and have a mechanism, but there's a trade-off in the accuracy you get from these algorithms. So you can see in this graph that as you give users more privacy, typically you would expect to get less accuracy on the server side. And so there is a big contention on how much privacy you should give to a user. Users would want more privacy and a server would want more accuracy. So how do you mitigate this trade-off? And one way to do it is to allow feature-wise privacy. And what that means is typically for a user, the privacy need is driven by the most sensitive feature in their data. For example, if the data set has your SSN, then you would typically want a lot of privacy. But if your data set has some other features that you don't really care about, you might not want that much privacy, and the server would be happy to get more accuracy. So the idea is to allow differing levels of privacy to differing features. And that is the point of this work. But the issue is, how do we do this? Differential privacy typically does not allow you to do this. And the reason is that features are often correlated. So I'll give a very high level example on the challenge here. So even if you can't read it, it says, let's say your data has your SSN, your credit score and your parents' credit score. And you really care about preserving the privacy for your credit score, but you don't care about your parents' credit score. So you tell the server, this is my privacy demand. But from your parents' credit score, your credit score can be extrapolated to a great extent. So you should be also private for your parents' credit score. And these are aspects that are not captured in traditional differential privacy. And this is in our proposed framework that we call Bayesian coordinate differential privacy. We are cognizant of these correlations and we propose a systematic way to resolve this issue. I won't go into too much detail about the framework, but here are some conclusions that we have from our work. So for developers, I like to say that personalizing privacy levels allow you to get a better trade-off. You can make the user happy, and you can also possibly get better accuracy on the server side. But there is a need to be very careful when you're personalizing privacy. There should not be unexpected leakage due to implementing wrong frameworks. For example, there are ad hoc methods that don't take these correlations into account, and you should not be implementing those frameworks. Our proposed framework is very rigorous. It gives very rigorous mathematical guarantees of privacy. And it's also very systematic, and you can use it to implement algorithms. For policymakers, I would say that privacy is being seen more and more as a right, as a fundamental right. So there is a need for legislation on privacy. And feature-wise privacy allows you to have a good middle ground between users being satisfied and the server being satisfied. I won't go too much into detail, but there are works that say very strict privacy regulations like GDPR hurt small businesses, while it helps monopolies like Google. So you should be more cognizant on how exactly you implement these privacy laws. And your law should typically account for proper usage of frameworks. It shouldn't be very ad hoc. if you have any questions or remarks, I'd love to hear from you after this symposium. Thank you.
Who has a question?
Thank you very much. Quick question on how are you contextualizing the definition of privacy, since it tends to be kind of more of a subjective a measure as opposed to objective. So in kind of its relationship to different like Europe versus US culture.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that is actually the benefit of differential privacy. It is no longer a subjective binary thing like I have privacy or I don't have privacy. It gives you an exact quantification of how much privacy there is in an algorithm. The other side is you might need to explain it to users what a particular number means. Like, what is privacy level of 5? Is it a good? Is it bad? So maybe there needs to be more outreach to make people understand what differential privacy means at a high level.
My name is Gideon. I'm a fourth year computer science PhD student here at EASE. As we all know, AI models are becoming increasingly valuable assets. If anything, they're already among the most valuable assets in the world. Companies like OpenAI are valued at many hundreds of billions of dollars, and they are hyper-focused on just producing really good general purpose AI models. This is all great, but with the proliferation of these models, it's introduced a range of problems, and one such problem is model ownership. And what I mean by ownership is that we don't have a reliable way to say that a model is owned by a specific entity just given access to the model itself. So if I am given API access to an OpenAI model, there's no real way for me to know that this model was truly trained by OpenAI. We just kind of assume that that's the case. This is a quite broad problem, and I have perhaps a general example. Consider when a model M is open sourced, you could think of this as like the Llama family from Meta, where they release all of the weights, and most people are free to use them however they please. But there are actually restrictions, like Llama has a license that kicks in when you have a certain amount of users. Like, so a massive company can't just pick up Llama and use it for their money-making purposes. But let's imagine that some AI company X just takes Llama and wraps it a bit, maybe in some, maybe they fine-tune it or do some low-level changes to it, and host that and call it Model M Prime, or maybe they name it something related to their company. How can the public know that this has taken place? And yeah, this isn't just a hypothetical scenario. In 2024, a startup released a model called Reflection 70 Bill. What they did was they released open source weights and then also provided an API that users could interact with directly. Supposedly, they have a new reflection tuning technique that imbued the model with class-leading performance. But it was quickly discovered that it was just a wrapper around Anthropic's Claude model. What they were doing was literally forwarding the prompts to Anthropic, and then they tuned the open source weights to kind of mimic Claude as close as possible within their capabilities. So in this example, it was easy to determine that a model was stolen in some sense because the company was kind of sloppy in how they deployed their wrapper. But you can imagine a more competent startup or company taking Llama, using it for purposes that it's not permitted to be used in, and making money off it when they really shouldn't. So this motivates the ownership issue. What my research has focused on is enabling verifiable ownership of such models. In particular, we developed a cryptographically sound mechanism for ownership. And this just means there's a really strong and high assurance guarantee that when the ownership scheme says, yes, this model is owned by company A, it really is owned by that entity. In particular, we resolve a crucial time ordering issue of prior work where basically there are attacks where an adversary can always plead deniability or due to like issues with ordering of ownership, there's always a case where they can defer the blame to another entity. We support ownership over API access only. So you don't need access to the model itself. You just need access to query the model and observe the responses. Our protocol is efficient in the sense that it doesn't introduce much overhead beyond what you're paying for inference in the first place. And it can be generically instantiated from any vectoring scheme. And vectoring is a well-studied aspect of machine learning, and there are multiple ways to instantiate it. In a bit more detail, we develop new cryptographic definitions that really pinpoint what we mean by ownership. Specifically, completeness and soundness capture that the model will not give you the wrong answer. If a model is actually owned by some entity, the verification algorithm will give you the right answer. And conversely, if the model is not owned, it will never give you like a false positive where it somehow is linked to a company that isn't actually linked to it. Additionally, functionality preservation just means that a owned model should preserve roughly the same performance as the base model, and you shouldn't be able to remove the ownership component of the model without destroying its performance. So this really means that the ownership mechanism is really tightly coupled with the model itself after you apply our protocols. So you can see that our construction at a very high level takes a backdooring method, let's say BADNet, and a secure cryptographic hash, let's say SHA-3. We put these primitives into our construction, and it spits out 3 algorithms: embed, prove, and verify. And these algorithms work as follows. You take the model, you take your base model and your ownership ID. For simplicity, let's say that the owner ID is just the name of the company, but it can be more complicated than that if needed to get a stronger authentication guarantee. But given these 2 things, it will spit out an owned model. And then given this owned model, I can prove as the owner that I indeed own it, where that means I produce a proof and I can release this proof to the public, and the public can run the verification algorithm, which will spit out yes or no or true or false, depending on whether verification succeeded or not. And because our scheme meets strong notions of completeness and soundness, that will always be the case. This work is currently under submission. It's joint work with Sundong Garg, Hui Li, and Mingo and Wang. But we hope to release a draft soon. Happy to take any questions. And if there are any technical questions about the exact protocol, happy to go through that offline. Thank you.
Who has a question?
Thank you very much. In the example you gave at the beginning with the repurposing of Claude, were you aware of any terms that Anthropic had that prevented this kind of, you called it like wrapping of it or repackaging? And if so, is that common in the industry, or is open sourcing it, does that make it not something we're worried about?
I see. I'm not actually aware if Claude explicitly barred what that startup did. It could very much be the case that Anthropic didn't mind as long as they're, the company is still paying for API access. Maybe they're okay with that. But in the additional example where an open source model has a well-defined license that is released with it, I don't know of any cases off the top of my head where license has been violated, but I guess these cases are much more difficult to catch, just because you could spend a lot of effort to fine-tune a model and make it behave in a way that is kind of undetectable without an ownership scheme being in place in the beginning. Yeah, great question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ruby. I'm from the Policy School. Today, I'm going to talk to you about AI incident-informed policy. So AI is becoming a larger part of our lives, but governance hasn't really kept up in areas where AI fails us. Specifically, we are underutilizing AI incident data to inform policy, and the reporting mechanisms we have for collecting these incidents are not standardized. A powerful example will be of Robert Williams, a Black man from Detroit was wrongfully convicted after facial recognition misidentified him. He spent over 30 hours in jail for a crime he did not commit. So this incident was widely reported and eventually led to policy reforms limiting the use of facial recognition system in policing. This incident marks a really important of why we need to understand AI incidents, because they reveal where risks exist and the gaps in our governance systems for us to close it. And my research asked these two questions. First is, what can we learn from documented AI incidents, and what insufficiencies currently exist in our databases? So to look at what AI is going wrong in the world, I pulled around 400 incident data from the OECD AI Incident Monitor database for these 5 countries: US, China, France, Brazil, and Kenya, to see a holistic geographical coverage. Then they were coded into 7 categories from the MIT AI risk taxonomy into the categories that you can see, like socioeconomic, environmental harms, and etc. What I found striking was 32% of the risks and incidents were concentrated in the socioeconomic environmental harm area, labeled by the blue. These are basically governance competitive dynamics between firms or countries, impact on the workforce, governance failures, and others. The other large portion labeled by red are NAs. I coded these because they were incidents that were recorded for a country, but weren't actually related to AI at all, or were recorded, but they never actually took place. These were particularly prevalent for countries whose first language was not English, so all of the countries besides US. Next, I'm going to take a deeper dive into what it looks like on a country level when we take out these NAs. On the graph, you see in the parentheses N equals, that will be in the number of incidents left for countries after I've taken out the NAs. For US, France, and China, when I first downloaded them, each country had around 100 incidents. But for Kenya and Brazil, they did not. They had very limited data. So when you first look at this graph, it's very obvious that there's a large concentration of socioeconomic harms. This will be the impact coming from job displacement, governance failures, competitive dynamics. The largest 2 concentration for Kenya and China, the reasons were different. China's most recorded incidents were because of competitive dynamics, namely the US-China tech competition and export controls. And Kenya, there were reports of tech companies' exploitation of Kenya's gig economy labor to fine-tune their models or adjust models or inputs. Also, looking at the United States, who had a large portion of malicious actors and misuse, the green label, these were incidents where AI was used to create misinformation or disinformation during the election times, creation of false, harm, or sexually explicit materials, and just AI-generated image, text, or videos for scam purposes. Looking at France concentration for the privacy and security orange category, this was because the deployment of facial recognition system during the Olympics sparked concerns of privacy for citizens and athletes. Brazil stood out for a different reason. That its largest concentration was in privacy and security. This was because incidents were concentrated mostly that tech companies were scraping social media data without consent or knowledge in cases where children's images were used. You see, not a lot of incidents were seen in the misinformation category. This doesn't mean that these incidents do not exist. It could just be they were grouped into other categories like malicious actors or misuse, or they were underreported due to language barrier reasons, or they were just hard to capture in the current database. So moving forward, my first recommendation is for database developers, owners, and operators to align and request incident database details to first time and location of each incident, what type of AI systems were involved, the cause of the incident, nature of the harm caused, identification of responsible entities or systems, as well as the risk level of AI systems. Recommendation 2 is targeted for policymakers is to definitely incorporate AI's incident reporting and analysis into governance mechanisms. Looking at AI incident data, it not only informs, identify, and justify future policy topics, It also informs policy focus areas. At countries, they could target particularly country-specific risk domains. They could tackle and also prevent future rising trends. And I'm happy to take questions. Thank you so much for listening.
Hi, thank you so much. I am wondering whether it makes sense to approach operational definitions for these sorts of categories for incident tracking, just sort of as a whole, or if it needs sort of a policy specific case by case or country by country approach.
For me, I think it would make more sense to go case by case or at least country by country, because as you like each country, they do definitely face different types of incident category. So it would be much more effective to impose an overall standardized policy than to specifically target those that are unique for each country. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Audrey Mitchell, and my research focuses on the intersection between generative AI and the litigation process. So that's trial and pretrial processes. Now, the reason this is important is because we rely on our litigation process to be fair. But the legal field as a whole works very slowly in responding to new technologies. In addition, it can only work reactively, not proactively, by adapting existing legal rule systems to new types of technological problems. So it becomes important to evaluate those rule systems to determine whether they'll be able to stand up in the face of a new technology like Gen AI. And to focus this presentation, I want to look at one aspect of the litigation process. That's evidence authenticity. How we can trust that audio-visual evidence is what it sounds and looks like it is. And we can easily imagine that, for example, a deepfaked video could be used to incriminate or exonerate someone at trial. So to probe this question, I want to talk about how the legal field has responded so far to generative AI. First, we have case law. Now, probably the most famous strands of cases in this area are cases like Mata v. Avianca, where lawyers use ChatGPT to draft legal briefs and get caught when there are AI hallucinated citations to fake cases in that brief. So those have been common, but there have actually also been a couple of cases where the court has had to deal with deepfake allegations. So for example, in Huang v. Tesla, which was a wrongful death case about a car crash involving a Tesla in autopilot mode, there was a dispute over a video of Elon Musk making statements about autopilot safety. In that case, Tesla's counsel said they couldn't admit the authenticity of that video because Elon Musk is just so famous that anyone could make a deep fake of him. And the court in that case strongly rejected Tesla's reasoning. They said that by that logic, any famous person could object to any video of them. And the court cautioned us not to use the potential for deepfakes to avoid taking responsibility for what we say and do. So that's one response to deepfake allegations, but we've also seen cases where judges have arguably given too much credence to these types of allegations. For example, in the Kyle Rittenhouse murder trial, there was a video and prosecution counsel just tried to zoom in on that video on an iPad so the jury could see it better. Defense counsel objected, saying that Apple's pinch to zoom function used AI to manipulate video in unknown ways. So if prosecution was allowed to zoom in, the video could show something that never actually happened. And the judge in that case agreed. He didn't let them zoom in on the video. So the problem with this case law is that it shows very inconsistent responses from judges. And that points to a need for more standardized guidance. And that brings me to the second legal response up here, which is proposed amendments to the federal rules of evidence. Those are the rules governing what can and can't come into evidence at trial. One of those rules is about authenticity, and it currently sets a very low bar. As long as there's a sufficient basis to find that a piece of evidence is what it seems to be, that evidence is deemed authentic. The problem is that question of authenticity is evaluated using metrics, for example, like whether a witness can recognize the sound of someone's voice in a recording. Those are the same metrics that can now be easily falsified using Gen AI. So in response, the advisory committee to the federal rules of evidence is considering an amendment to raise the bar to show authenticity when there's been a deepfake allegation. And the problem with this approach is that it takes a very long time. The earliest that this amendment could go into effect is May 2028. We don't know what's going to happen in courts or with Gen AI itself in the next 3 years. And that brings me to this third legal response, which is judicial standing orders. These are orders from an individual judge that govern all of the proceedings that happen in their courtroom. There are very few limitations on what these standing orders can look like, and they can be implemented, revised, or revoked at any time. That makes it a very flexible tool which can be appropriate in response to an evolving technology like Gen AI. You can see from this map on here, there are about 60 to 80 standing orders, depending on how you count nationwide so far. Now, I want to briefly talk about the steps that I think the legal field should take to preserve authenticity of evidence in response to Gen AI. First, judges need technical education in this area. A lot of what I've spoken about revolves around decisions that judges make. And regardless of whatever the rules are on paper, judges are the ones responsible for adjudicating technological disputes in front of them. That means they have to have a technical understanding of Gen AI's capabilities, limitations, and potential for misuse. This is a necessary prerequisite to any other steps. Second, I think that the federal rules of evidence will need to be amended to deal with this authenticity problem. But third, while we're waiting for that 3-year process to take place, judges should use their standing orders as a stopgap to respond to Gen AI and deepfake allegations that come up before and at trial. But of the standing orders already out there, there are some common pitfalls that people will need to respond to as judges continue to promulgate these orders. First, they need to define AI precisely. For example, saying generative AI used to draft original content before or at trial. In some of the standing orders already out there, they're phrased so broadly that AI would encompass Grammarly or Microsoft Word's autocomplete feature, very common features that I think judges probably don't intend to include in their standing orders. Second, judges need to be consistent. For example, in one jurisdiction I looked at, there were 2 different standing orders. That basically means that in one courthouse, there were 2 judges that had AI-related standing orders. One of them said no AI use at all. One of them said AI use is fine, you just have to disclose it. And furthermore, I spoke to one of these judges and they had no idea that a judge just down the hall from them had such a different order. So judges need to talk to each other when they're promulgating these standing orders to avoid creating a trap for litigants. And finally, judges should consider using these standing orders not just pre-trial, but to govern at-trial deepfake disputes. Of all of the standing orders I reviewed, currently only 2 deal with deepfake allegations or Gen AI's use at trial. But judges can use these standing orders to provide, for example, for out-of-court hearings on evidence authenticity, to prevent attorneys from arguing about deep fakes when there's no basis in fact to do so, or even to change the burden required for authenticity when there's a deep fake allegation. So if the legal field takes these steps, I think we'll be well on our way to ensuring that evidence authenticity and litigation's fairness remains intact. Thank you.
Any questions?
Hi, Audrey. Thank you for your presentation. It was lovely speaking with you recently for the Berkeley Technology Law Journal podcast about these issues. Everyone should be on the lookout for that. It'll be coming out soon. I'm just wondering if you were to draft your ideal amendment for the federal rules of evidence, what would that look like? Thank you.
Yeah, this is a pretty hot topic. Currently, there's a lot of dispute in the legal field about what that amendment should look like. I'm in favor of language that's been proposed that would conditionally raise the bar to show authenticity. So right now, the bar is that sufficiency standard we talked about. And this amendment would provide that if there is an objection made to evidence's authenticity based on a deepfake allegation, that objection itself would also have to meet a sufficiency standard. But then if they met that sufficiency standard, then the proponent of the evidence, the party offering the evidence, would have to show by a preponderance standard, more likely than not, that the evidence is authentic. Preponderance standard is higher than the normal sufficiency standard. So that sort of triggers a higher burden in the specific case of a at least semi-substantiated deepfake allegation, and I would be in favor of that. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ezine, and I am currently a PhD student in EECS. And today I'll be talking to you all about AI in the public services. So AI is increasingly being used in public services, but it's often challenging to move from theory to practice when addressing issues related to marginalized communities. And so it can be difficult for a couple of different reasons, some of which include reasons related to issues with the data or administrative or technological burdens that resource-constrained organizations face. And so for my research, I've been exploring how AI can be used and leveraged in ways that are responsive and supportive to organizations providing public services, particularly as it relates to homelessness. So I've been partnering with an organization called Breaking Ground, based in New York, and they work to provide street outreach services and other housing services to unhoused populations based in New York. And so we've been working together to see how we could support the work that they do. And so in our collaboration, we meet, and we've been developing the following research questions. And so the first question tries to ask, how can we measure better outcomes in homelessness? And also, once we've defined these better measures, can we measure the impact of street outreach on housing outcomes? And so the way that we've been approaching this is in a more collaborative and participatory design approach. And so we started by first building out by first helping them understand what are the problems that they face in different parts of their organization. I asked them just generally, like, what do they wish they could know from their data? And from there, it became really clear that a lot of the typical features that you might extract from a data set and feed into a machine learning model didn't apply here. But they did have a lot of rich information that was hidden in their case notes. And so from there, these case notes were created daily by their outreach team, by their case managers, and it just logged their everyday interactions. And so we worked with them to identify outcomes that better captured both their client goals as well as their outreach team, the arduous job of being a street outreach worker. And so because housing can be it's a really complex problem, and it's not necessarily a goal for all of their clients, either because of, some people have different goals, or some people it's not even possible for housing to be a goal, especially in the case of those who are undocumented. And so really defining different outcomes that aren't typical in a lot of these administrative data sets was really important for this organization. And so also, because a lot of the services happen in siloed agencies and organizations, it was really important to try to think about how we can assess housing placement, because the actual housing placement category was a very unstable outcome in the data, because it's just really hard to track people. A lot of these agencies don't necessarily talk to each other. So, somebody may be hospitalized or maybe housed in one spot, but you won't see that. It won't show up in the data. And so really trying to be thoughtful about what outcomes mattered to Breaking Ground and how we might measure those and capture those from their case note data was really important. So instead, we thought of other outcomes, such as a notion of client progress or some notion of building trust and rapport from the outreach worker side. And we developed some methodology to strategically collect expertly annotated data from those notes, as well as combine that with local LLMs to retrieve those outcomes from the case note data. They have millions of case notes, and so it's really expensive and challenging to try to have a human like annotate them themselves, every single one of them themselves. And so we've tried to make that process easier and also still reliable and hold on to, the statistical guarantees that we would like to see. And so this was a really interactive and iterative process that we did with them. And it's still ongoing. And we're currently in the process of, collecting more expert annotated data and improving the model performance on the case notes. And then also we are trying to think about other ways and that might be helpful. So one way that came up was thinking about how we might generate summaries of the notes, because, like I said, there's so many notes that are generated on a daily basis. And figuring out a way to summarize the notes so that directors and supervisors can review and like flag things that they should follow up with their team is something that came up as being helpful. So ongoing and still in progress. But I guess to conclude my talk today, so we have an initial model that's working. So it allows us to create a methodology that allows us to collect, human expert labels, a limited number, and combine them with LLM predictions in order to assess the impact of street outreach from case note data. So as I mentioned, the expert labels are just really hard and expensive to collect, but LLM predictions are super unreliable. And so you want to have a principled way of collecting and combining them that still holds on to statistical validity in our final evaluation. And I think this process has really been helpful. And I think Breaking Ground can now communicate the impact of their work to stakeholders and as well to their internal team members to help them to get more resources and motivate the service work that they've done. And so, I'll just end with some learnings and recommendations from this work. So we've learned a lot from this project and it's still, like I mentioned, still ongoing. So we're still learning. And so one thing that I've learned is that, these off-the-shelf methods don't immediately work for data about people, specifically people from marginalized communities. Because more often there's either data that's missing or it's messy. And really it requires addressing these issues either before or during the building of models, or at least being aware of these issues so that, you can try to assess like the downstream impact and if it's really worth, having this model being used for this purpose. Another thing that I think has really helped me that I've taken away is like, these challenges aren't hindrances. They're actually like more opportunities for innovation. And the way I see it is until these models are working for everyone and generalizable for everyone, then we can't really say that they work well. So I think there's a lot more to be done. And lastly, I'll just end with, I think in general, these types of like multidisciplinary collaborations and stakeholder engagements, they just take a lot of time. I've been working with Breaking Ground for the last 5 years. And it's only now that we're seeing, some good results, but I think they take time and patience and just a willingness to meet people where they are and kind of build up the communication and skill set so that you all are able to talk the same language and get to a place where everybody feels good about the thing that you're building and empowered to make educated and informed decisions. And so, thank you all. And I'm looking forward to your questions.
In working with data from marginalized groups, and it seems also personally identifiable data, potentially, I would love to think about the technical side of things.
And grab the second question. They both are at the same time. I can choose. Okay.
Sure. Yeah, this is an awesome project. I wondered if you could talk about the motivation of your partner and what really helped them sort of stay consistent with it, or how much of a lift it was for them and what helped them get through it. If it was, you sort of talked about internal team information, but I don't know, for like funders or something else. It's just, it's quite a bit of work for them potentially. And just how do you get them to do this?
So I would say that maybe I'll answer the first question because it's a little easier and then I'll get to you. Okay, so in terms of the technical software that we've been using, so one, the data is encrypted, the data has been removed. Like we've removed all personal and sensitive information from the case note data. And then in addition to that, we've been using local models so we can download them and run them on our computer, like take your choice of model and just run it on your computer. So you're not sending the data back to, X, Y, and Z company. And there are a ton of different packages that you can use like through Python. And so we've kind of tried a couple of them, but yeah, you can just use a local model. I think the most popular one is using Obama. But yeah, so that's what we've been doing there. And then in terms of the organization and how much of a lift it's been, I think the biggest lift for them has been just a lot of like turnover within the organization. So there was a brief period of time where they had to, pause because their head of like data and evaluation had taken a new opportunity. And so that took a bit to kind of figure out like, okay, who else is this project still of interest? Are there other things we can do that could be helpful? And at that point, we were actually pursuing a different question, a more like optimization type question, but then pivoted because basically because this other question seemed to be of more interest to them and they had more people to kind of support. The main support, so basically I'm offering free labor is like how this has been working. So I really just listen and they kind of have told me what is of most importance to them and their challenges. And we've kind of just like gone from there. But it doesn't really require, like, I guess I do most of the technical work and try to work and explain and we try to work together. But in terms of like resources from them, we don't ask for any resources from them. It's just what do they need? And like, how can we kind of get to a place of understanding for others.
Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Patak. I'm a PhD student in social welfare. And I will be talking today about my research on public participation in AI governance. So as many of you are probably aware, there's a lack of meaningful participation of the public in AI governance efforts. And while there is some consensus that this is a fundamental aspect of AI accountability and AI safety, the question of how to do it and how to do it well is still open. So you probably have heard so many calls to public participation, engagement of stakeholders, but nobody really talks about how to do it, how to actually get to that implementation. So that's what I'm trying to answer in my research through the following questions. So what public participation approaches are currently being implemented around the world, specifically in health and human services for AI governance efforts? And what features of these approaches have worked and haven't worked and why? And how can we strengthen public participation in the design, oversight, and adoption of AI systems for use in public services? So for that, I used a scope and literature review approach of the literature and a didactic qualitative analysis using different theories from democracy and public policy that have been present for a long time. And I developed an analytical framework where I coded data of the cases that I found in the articles, and where I extracted data and coded the data and organized it according to the theories, the key constructs from the theories. And some of these constructs allow me to identify the key information that was present in the cases, such as what was the model of engagement, who were the participants or the publics, what was the governance issue, what were the objectives, and specifically what were the key outcomes and how were those achieved. And then I used all of this data and clustered and developed 4 different clusters. And I developed a matrix of or conceptual mapping, as you can see on the right-hand side. On the horizontal axis, I mapped the cases according to the level of empowerment that was granted to participants or the public. And as you can see on the less empowering side of the spectrum, more consistent with participatory washing, You have instances of participation where the public was just asked for feedback and there was no real implementation of their feedback. It was mostly an advisory and tokenistic approach to participation. And on the other side of the spectrum, there's more of an empowerment where stakeholders were actually given some real authority and decision making, leading to a concrete outcome that was implemented in practice. And on the other dimension of analysis that I used for this mapping was taking from democracy, a democracy debate on whether it's best to do deliberation versus action. And as you can see, there are different kinds of cases where it's more appropriate to deliberate on a topic that is a broad ethical concern around AI governance, usually in a situation where it's going to be implemented across different contexts, different use cases. And that's more appropriate for deliberation. So something like a citizen council, a summit, a jury. And on the other hand, there's more action-oriented approaches taken from participatory democracy theory, where you can really see it's most effective to apply a more action-oriented approach to participation, such as participatory design, data commons, and so on. And these are usually more effective for narrow use cases of AI governance, where it's like going to be deployed in a specific context. Okay. And so I have a variety of policy recommendations. One is it's important to be careful about how to select the type of engagement according to the nature of the policy issue. So as I actually just mentioned, if it's a broad ethical policy issue that is across different contexts, then it's best to leverage the deliberation-oriented type of approaches. Whereas if it's some more narrow use case for that is trying to ask questions for specific stakeholders or impacted communities, it's better to use a more action-oriented type of approach. But regardless of what type of approach, one important finding of this research is that empowerment is crucial. It's almost like obvious, but it's actually in practice, it doesn't happen that often. But it is not enough to just invite people to come and engage and deliberate or design some process. It's actually important to give them power to make decisions and or recommendations. And it's important to also ensure that the engagement results in action and that the objectives are met. So it's often useful to have a concrete outcome out of the engagement, either a report or something. But beyond that, there's need to be some concrete end result that everybody can understand that actually that happened. And then another important recommendation is that there's got to be buy-in from the institution or the organization that is being asked to participate in this engagement. It's better to embed these approaches within some sort of existing organization, as opposed to just like an outside event that is happening outside of any real, deployment of AI. And then this is very important. So beyond being just making calls about inclusivity is actually quite important to ensure that you have that you're allocating sufficient resources and time to sampling and recruiting the appropriate group of participants, whether a representative group or a more narrow purposive sample of participants according to your policy issue. And lastly, it's extremely important to follow up and communicate on the outcomes and potentially after the engagement has ended and potentially invite for future outcomes and opportunities for engagement. So I'm happy to take any questions at this point. Thank you. Thank you.
Any questions?
Thank you for very excellent. Quick question. What did you find anything about unique about the topic of emerging technology, AI, machine intelligence, that influenced the structure of your recommendations or of your study? Because it sounds like I could replace any intervention with kind of the approach. So I'm wondering if there's any kind of sensitivity to what you're recommending to an emerging technology such as AI in particularly.
Yeah, that's a great question, because this literature and work on governance, public participation governance, it could apply to, and it has applied to many different areas of technology and science. But what I found that it's slightly different with this AI, Gen AI especially, domain is that people are way more concerned of like high risk, high stakes, potential consequences. So those ethical conversations around ethics of the technology are much more prominent in some of these approaches. So people tend to start with broad questions about how AI could influence not just services, but their life in general. So they tend to be more of a broad, understanding of the technology and how it could really impact their life. And yeah, I think that's what I've seen is different, because I did try to look at different like technologies from previous like iterations of applications and services. But what's unique about AI is that people have much more ethical concerns about how it's going to impact services in practice. Some concerns that haven't been brought up before with different technologies. So, yeah.
I can invite Gideon up. Gideon Lichfield is currently a UC Berkeley Tech Policy Fellow, which is a program we offer to experts from industry, academia, civil society, government, and journalism. Journalists are a very important player in the tech policy space. Non-residential fellowship, they come and they learn, they get trained up on how do they translate their research into impactful policy deliverables. Former editor-in-chief of Wired and MIT Tech Review, and I believe you're doing some new things. Maybe you could share with us. A lot of stuff, a lot of things. So Gideon, thank you so much for joining us today. Would you like to use the podium or the handheld?
I'll use the podium. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Brandy. Thank you to the AI Policy Hub for having me here. Congratulations to all the Policy Hub fellows on your work. As your work shows, I think AI is being applied in so many different fields, in so many different ways. And that is sort of the subject of what I want to talk about, because that wide range of applications is what makes it really hard to discuss AI policy and to discuss AI in a way that makes sense to the public and to policymakers, and therefore to have a sensible conversation about what we want and don't want to do with AI. So Brandy asked me to tell you a bit about what I'm doing. Yes, I worked at all these places. I took some time off. Now I write a newsletter about the future of democracy, to which the first question people always ask me is there one? And I write about the long-term future. I write about what I think there could be in 20 or 30 or 40 years' time, or even further out, ways of governing that would be appropriate to the 21st century, that would take account of the kind of world we live in, the kinds of technologies we have, the pace at which they change, the affordances that they give us for making large-scale social decisions. And AI inevitably plays a part in this, both as a factor in affecting the kind of world we live in, the nature of the economies that we have, for instance, the way in which decisions are made, but also as a tool for enabling perhaps some forms of deliberative democracy or participative democracy, enabling better decision-making and enabling better forms of lawmaking. There are many ways in which it could be used to our benefit. And of course, there are many ways in which it could be harmful. So I think about these issues as they interrelate with the questions of governance in general. About a dozen years ago, I was a fellow at a different organization called the Data and Society Research Institute in New York. And it was created to look at the policy implications of what was then the big buzzword, which was big data, which feels like a very quaint term these days. And it was very hard at that moment to explain in terms that the public could understand why they needed to care about big data and its implications. And the best framework that we had, and I think that we still have, was to talk about privacy. Privacy was a concept that people could grasp onto as something that was under threat if something indefinable happened with big data that was sort of out of control. People could grasp the notion that they had such thing as privacy, and that if companies or governments or whoever had access to their data and did things with their data without their knowledge, then that was a privacy invasion, and that was bad, and that was something that you needed to defend against. But privacy was still a very inadequate framework for really talking about what the implications of big data were, because if you lose privacy in the physical world, what does it mean? I know somebody snoops through your bedroom window and, sees you having sex with your partner, or with somebody you shouldn't be having sex with, maybe, or they catch something that you're doing, and maybe that's some compromising information that the person who happens to have seen you could use against you if they so chose. With data and the loss of data privacy, both the amounts of data that are involved, that people that can be obtained about you, and the uses to which those data can be put, and the number of actors whom that data can get to, are just vastly greater than if someone just looks through your window. And so the notion that your data might be being used in ways that could harm you, or without your knowledge, or by people that you're not aware of, that is something that people could grasp. But the idea that this is a privacy violation felt very, and still feels very, inadequate as a way to talk about what it means to have your data out in the world there. But, to this day, we don't have a better way of talking about big data and its implications. And today, people understand that the loss of their data privacy means that they could be manipulated online. That social media feeds show them certain things based on their past preferences, that it might mean that they get discriminated against in housing decisions or in hiring decisions. It might mean that they're shown different pricing on websites depending on where they come from. But those kind of risks are now understood, I think, by the general public in a way that they weren't maybe 10 years ago. But nonetheless, it's still, I think most people have a sense that even if they know or have an idea about the ways in which their data might be being used, they still don't have any sense of agency. What can I do about it? It's out of my control. I've given up. With AI, we have, I would say, an order of magnitude more complex problem than that, because AI is such a multi-purpose technology. We all know the concept of dual-use technologies. I think this term came into vogue around the time of the atomic bomb. We understand that nuclear fission is a dual-use technology. You have controlled fission, it's a power plant. If you have uncontrolled fission, it's a bomb. We understand that a rocket is a dual-use technology. If you point it straight up, it delivers a satellite into space. If you point it at an angle, it delivers a bomb onto one of your enemies. We understand that drones are dual-use technologies. If you send them into one geography, they monitor crops or deliver packages. And if you send them to another geography with a different set of instruments, then again, they deliver bombs. So all of those are dual-use technologies, but they're easy to understand because it's easy to understand that if you use the thing in this way, it does certain things. And if you do use it in another way, it does certain other things which are more harmful. It's very, very difficult to do that, to have that kind of understanding with AI, because AI is what another person called omni-use. And what they meant by saying omni-use is that you can use it pretty much for anything. We still don't know all of what uses to which AI will be put. It's evolving in front of our eyes, and the capabilities that it has today are different from the capabilities it will have next week. And we can't even predict all the uses to which it will be put. So it's omni-use in that sense. But I think it's also omni-use in another sense, which is that not only can you put it in many, many different uses, but within each of those uses, each of those applications, whether it has beneficial or harmful effects, depends on how it is applied, right? So, for example, one of the classic examples of this is in bail decisions. There's this algorithm called Compass that was used to help judges decide whether to grant bail to people who were facing criminal charges, and it was meant to introduce more fairness into the bail decisions by giving judges a kind of a risk score for each defendant. It turned out that in fact it was introducing racial discrimination into the bail granting process because of the data that went into the algorithm that was based on the way that past bail decisions were made. And so there are all these, that is just one example of the ways in which you apply AI in a particular case, but the ways in which you apply it, the kind of data it's based on, the criteria by which it works, then determine whether it ends up having a beneficial effect or a harmful effect. And that's what makes it so difficult to have this conversation about the uses of AI, because people are conditioned to say either AI good or AI bad, or in the best case, they might be able to think, well, AI is, AI is good for writing software, but it's not good for writing journalism. Or AI is good for medical diagnosis, but it's not good for doing psychotherapy. And everyone will have their own ideas of why it's good for this and why it's not good for that. But with any of those applications, there are ways to do it that are useful or ways to do it that are harmful, or maybe better put, there are benefits to using it and there are risks. So if you're writing software, what do you gain? Well, you gain speed. You can write code much more quickly. What do you risk? Well, your software might be more likely to have security vulnerabilities that you didn't spot, or just be inefficient because it's drawing on other code out in the world that was inefficient. And the software engineers who are using AI to write software may lose their expertise because they're not doing the hands-on work of coding themselves. If you're doing medical diagnosis, what do you gain? Again, maybe you gain some speed. Maybe AI is able to catch some diagnoses that a human doctor would miss because the doctor lacks certain knowledge or doesn't make a good or makes the wrong interpretation of an X-ray, for example. But the AI may miss certain edge cases. It may misdiagnose things in certain examples. Once again, there is a loss of expertise. So the right way to talk about what AI does in each of these areas has much more to do with the specifics of how it's applied in each of those cases, rather than is it good for this or bad for that? Is this a beneficial use or a beneficial application or a harmful application? So when we talk about AI policy, when we even have the concept of AI policy, that implies that we're still thinking of AI as a thing. So just as we have policies for bombs or power plants or drones or cars or highways or, take your pick, we have a policy for those things because we understand them as things that are used in a certain way, and therefore we can create a policy around them. But what AI policy is really is just its existing policies under different conditions. When we introduce AI to a process, whether that is making decisions on job applicants, or whether it's used in legal processes, as we were just discussing earlier, or whether it is on medical diagnosis, or whether it's in sentencing decisions, or whether it's in decisions on in the battlefield, wherever AI is used, all we're really doing is introducing a different process to or making changes to processes that already exist, decision-making processes that already exist. And so the use of AI may change the data that go into that process. They may change some of the criteria that are used, but the process is still the process, and the questions around it are still the same questions. Who is responsible and accountable for taking these decisions? Who is impacted by the decisions? What does it cost to run this process? How transparent is it? How is it governed? Is it fair? Does it achieve its stated goals? These are the basic questions that we ask with pretty much anything that we do. And when we add AI to it, we're still asking the same questions. It's just that it changes some of the conditions. So in a way, I'm arguing that there is no such thing as AI policy. Now, I don't want to take that too far. Of course, there are some things that are now possible that were not possible before AI. And there are certain cases in which we might want to say, well, we want to have a rule that you shouldn't use AI for this thing or that thing. Or we want to recognize that certain things are possible now that were not possible before AI. And we have to have certain policies for those things. And, a good example might be one of the biggest AI risks that people talk about is the bioterrorism risk. Somebody uses AI to design a deadly virus and then, proliferates it around the world. And if AI makes that kind of process easier, then we should have policies around it. But even then, there are really policies about bioterrorism, which we already have. We need new mechanisms, perhaps, to enforce bioterrorism risks and to think about how we prevent them. A lot of those do not even have to do with AI. They do with who has access to the raw materials for building a bioweapon. How do you regulate the labs, and so on? So AI policy is things like that. But above all, AI policy is housing policy. AI policy is environmental policy. It's economic policy. It's defense policy. It's health policy. AI policy is policy. And the sooner I think everyone in the policy sphere understands that, the better our chances are of getting the policies we need.
Okay, we actually have time for one question. Any questions?
Hi, Gideon. Thank you so much. I'm curious, in a ecosystem where you're saying policy is more of a federated approach, where it's going in these sort of different areas outside of just essential AI policy, could you talk about accounting for AI literacy? I'm almost prompted by one of the PhD investigations about public involvement in the governance. What about accounting for that with how individuals currently, a lot of the time, are not fully informed on what AI is and how you address it in those different segments?
Yeah, I think in a sense, I guess I would say that this is going to sound like I'm trolling you, but I'm not really. I would say that just as I might argue that there is no such thing as AI policy, I might argue that there is no such thing as AI literacy. And what I mean by that is that I think, yes, you can educate people about what AI is, and you can try and teach them, you can try and show them how does a large language model work, or give them a sense of how it's trained or how it does inferences. And you can point to examples like hallucination. You can do all of these things, but really, to really understand what AI is doing, I think you have to look at it in the context of a given process, a given setting, a given decision. So by the parallel of what I'm saying, an AI policy is really a policy for that particular sphere with an understanding of the way that AI changes the conditions within that sphere. I think AI literacy is similarly an understanding of what does AI mean for this problem that I care about. So I would want to teach AI literacy within the context of, let's say that you have a group of citizens who are being brought together to talk about zoning or about housing policy. Maybe that's a better example. Housing policy in San Francisco. And within that, have a discussion of how is the city making decisions on what to zone? Is it using AI in some of its decisions on what to zone how? Or how are developers making their calculations over what, where to develop and how much money to invest? Or how is affordable housing being allocated, and how is AI being used to make decisions on who is eligible? Any setting where AI is used, I think, is then more fruitful as a way to explain what are the impacts of this in this case, because to try and draw a generalized story of what AI means becomes very abstract. So I would want to see AI literacy very much in the context of the specific case in which it's being used, and I think that's a more hands-on way for people to get a sense of what it does.
Okay, thank you so much, Gideon. I have lots of questions around how you feel of general purpose versus
algorithmic decision-making system, how that comes in play, and transparency, but I'll find you later. Thank you so much, Gideon. And thank you to our amazing fellows. A big round of applause for them. So I just want to say a huge congratulations and thank you, everyone, for coming and joining us today. I also want to flag that we have a Tech Policy Week here at UC Berkeley on campus. It's October 20th through 25th. And also follow that QR or find that QR code. That's where we house a variety of information on the vibrant tech policy ecosystem here at UC Berkeley. And we'll share more information about Tech Policy Week. And just thank you again for coming today. We really appreciate it. And just lastly, I'd love to bring up our fellows for a quick photo. So if you can come up to the front and appreciate everyone for joining today. So thank you so much.
And as they're coming up here, I want to thank all of the partners. We have the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, the Berkeley AI Research Lab, and the Citrus Policy Lab here at Citrus and the Banatao Institute. And so thank you again for all of your support.